Hello everybody, my name is Maurice Button. I'm the CEO of City and Financial Global, and it's my great pleasure to be interviewing today Stephan Harrison, who's the Professor of Climate and Environmental Change and also a Director of the Climate Change Risk Management. And Stephan's going to be giving a keynote address at our Climate Adaptation Summit, which is being held in central London on the 13th of March. Stephan, welcome.
Thank you.
Let's get stuck into the questions, if we may. My first question is, given the response by governments and the business community so far, are we realistically on course to limit the increase in global temperatures to 1.5 degrees and to achieve net zero by 2050?
That's a very good question, and I think to take the answer to the first question about whether we will keep to a global mean surface temperature of 1.5 degrees Celsius is almost certainly not. I think. At the moment we're about 1.2 degrees Celsius, but we've only reached 419 or so parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The likelihood of managing to not make that 1.5, that extra 3 degrees Celsius, 0.3 degrees Celsius rise is very, very unlikely given the trajectory we're on in terms of carbon emissions. So I think we should be very careful about looking at 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius in terms of policy estimates, because these are not really hard and fast. These are just guides given by climate scientists to politicians. Yep. To try and understand that the further we go down this warming route, the worse things will get. So 1.5 degrees, there's nothing magical about 1.5 degrees, and there's nothing magical about 2. It's just that these are policy prescriptions given by governments, and we've got to be very careful in trying to say that we're going to keep to those, because I suspect we're not going to.
So turning to my next question, which areas of critical national infrastructure, roads, rail, energy generation, distribution, etc., are most exposed to the dangers of climate change?
Well, I would argue that probably all of them are in one way or another. I mean, obviously, the obvious ones are port facilities, because sea level rise and changes in ocean and storminess will impact the coast in lots of different ways. That's going to be less of a problem in northern parts of Britain, where we have so-called isostatic rebound after the last glaciation. So in other words, the land is rising a few millimeters a year at the same time as sea level is rising. So essentially, I think if I were investing in ports, I'd probably do it in the northern part of Britain rather than the southern part of Britain. Southern part of Britain is either sinking or stable, so that means relative sea level rise is higher there. But ports are clearly going to be a big issue, and other infrastructure at or near sea level. So nuclear power stations, for instance, and nuclear facilities are and they recognise this issue very well. But of course, inland, you've got to really start thinking about what we're going to do for water security, especially when the climate becomes more variable. We expect variability of climate change to be a big driver of economic infrastructure and also the way in which we use infrastructure. So, what do we do with pre-existing reservoirs and pre-existing irrigation systems, canals, perhaps? These are things that I think that we really should be concentrating our understanding on. And also, of course, as the globe warms, cities are going to become much harder to live in. As we move to a strong push from movement from people from the countryside into urban areas, and that's a global trend, not just a UK trend. Cities, because of the urban heat islands and other things, are going to be you're going to have to really think about climate adaptation.
It's a frightening prospect, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
I mean, turning to the corporate concerns, if you like, what should companies be doing now in relation to preparing their operations for the consequences of climate change?
Well, obviously there are lots of facets to this issue. I mean, one of them clearly is an issue around things like TCFD, where corporations have to assess a series of scenarios about where they think climate change is going to be in the future and how they might then make themselves more resilient to that. Now, that's a really difficult thing for corporations to do, because how do you go around how do you develop a climate scenario without really understanding climate change or really understanding how we use climate models. So I think there really is a requirement, I think, for businesses and academics and scientists to get together, to work together to develop TCFD initiatives. But also there's an issue around due diligence. A lot of corporates, a lot of financial services are involved in helping clients manage the risks to the client's infrastructure and clients' assets as well. So a big issue around asset management. And so understanding climate change on a global scale, but also at the regional scale, I think is a real challenge for asset managers and others involved in trying to understand, the future variability in climate.
I mean, you mentioned there modelling and scenario planning and so on, but how accurate is climate modelling? And I suppose you, in terms of regional issues, if you're not a global company and say you're based in just one part of the UK, how granular is it possible to be in terms of looking at specific regions in the UK? Because clearly this is what businesses would most want.
Yes, of course. I mean, climate models are fantastically complicated things, and you could say they are one of the great scientific achievements of the 20th and 21st century. So they're amazing things. However, they're not very good at understanding future climates at very small spatial scales, the spatial scales at which you might have a factory or a part of an infrastructure developed. And they're not very good at things we really want to understand, which is precipitation, rainfall, because rainfall drives flooding. So the things that we really want them to be really good at, they're not so good at. They're excellent at understanding the large-scale behaviour of the atmosphere for decades in advance, and they're very good at other things, understanding Earth's surface systems and how they respond to climate change. But the things we really want them to, then which is small scale, regional scales, and things like precipitation, then they're not so good. Now, there have been massive advances in climate modelling over the last few years. UK CP18 is now running climate model projections at sub 2 or 3 kilometre scales. So there are lots of opportunities, I think, in the future for those sorts of scales to become embedded into financial planning and for corporates to understand future risk. But at the moment, there are some really important physical and technical issues stopping us understanding climate change at small scales. Doesn't mean to say we can't do it. It just means we have to be really careful that we understand the uncertainties, and we have to make sure those are understood by clients, corporate clients.
Yes. I suppose for the companies, I mean, understanding the impact on their own operations, their core operations, is clearly very important. But what about, or what advice do you give them about factoring in the implications for their supply chain, their customers, and I suppose the broader external environment in which they operate?
Well, in a sense, this is an issue around climate literacy, I think, and the problem is that climate literacy has not been widely embedded, I think, in decision making by corporates or financial services organisations. So, you've got, in a sense, climate change is such a big thing. It affects the politics, the economics, the social conditions under which you're investing. It affects the risks, the risks to your reputation if you don't take it seriously. It also impacts the sort of physical risks for your infrastructure. And it may, as you say, it may not just be the physical risks of where your factory is or your organisation is, your building, but it'll be the way in which climate change might interrupt supply chains, may interrupt physical risks of the places where you get your raw materials from. So I think this is something which is an extraordinarily big problem, and it can only be solved, I think, but with a much better discussion between all actors in this space. But it's something that climate modelling has a major role to play. Despite all the caveats that we talked about earlier, if you develop a series of climate model projections for your whole operation, and you at the same time raise the climate literacy within your organisation, then you are as well able as you can to understand and be able to deal with future risks.
Yeah, very interesting. I wish we had more time to continue, but as you just mentioned, there's a need for collaboration between all the major actors in the space. We very much hope that at the Climate Adaptation Summit on the 13th of March, we'll be doing just that. So, Stephan, thank you very much for your time today. We look forward to seeing you on the 13th of March.
Thank you very much.